Hello, my name is Antonio Aguilar. I'm a historical architect with the Technical Preservation Services of the National Park Service in Washington, D.C. Our office is responsible for the administration of the federal historic preservation tax incentives for historic rehabilitation. We also maintain the Secretary of the Interior standards for the treatment of historic properties, as well as produce and disseminate educational materials on the treatment of historic properties. I am very pleased to be a participant in this conference and give you an overview of how these tax incentives work and how they promote the preservation of historic properties, and show you a few examples of how this program has been a powerful tool for rehabilitating heritage industrial buildings. The National Park Service, through its Technical Preservation Services Division and the Internal Revenue Service, administer the program in partnership with the state historic preservation offices in every state. The Federal Historic Preservation Tax Incentives Program encourage private sector investment in the rehabilitation and reuse of historic buildings of every period, size, style, and type. It creates jobs and is one of the nation's most successful and cost-effective community rehabilitation programs. It has leveraged over $122 billion in private investment to preserve more than 48,000 historic properties since 1976. As you can see from this chart, most of our projects, over 74% of them, are under $5 million. So what are the basics of the tax credits? The owner is eligible for a 20% tax credit on the qualifying rehabilitation expenses for the project, also known as QREs. These QREs are established by the Internal Revenue Service. The project must be substantial, meaning that the cost of the project must exceed the greater of $5,000 or the property's adjusted basis used for tax purposes. Adjusted bases are calculated based on the purchase price of the property minus the cost of the land at the time of purchase minus depreciation taken for tax purposes plus the cost of the capital improvements made to the property since the time of purchase. The property must also be a certified historic structure, which means that the property must be listed individually or as part of a district. And then all rehabilitation work on the building for the project must meet the Secretary of the Interior standards for rehabilitation. So the program eligibility. In order to be eligible for the tax credits, the property must be either listed or eligible for listing in the National Register of Historic Places. If a property is not listed at the time the application is submitted, normally they have a certain amount of time after the project is completed to finish that process and have the property listed either individually or within a district. Again, the rehabilitation must be a substantial rehabilitation as defined previously. And also the property must be income producing, which means that it has to be used for a commercial purpose. It cannot be a owner occupied property or it cannot be your private residence. The National Register of Historic Places is the official list of the nation's historic places worthy of preservation. It was authorized by the National Preservation Act of 1966, which authorized the National Park Service to create a National Register of Historic Places as a national effort to coordinate and support public and private efforts to identify, evaluate, and protect the nation's historic and archaeological resources. The National Historic Preservation Act of 1966 also directed the National Park Service to establish standards for the treatment of historic properties. There are four different treatments, which are preservation, rehabilitation, restoration, and reconstruction. There are four treatments, and each one of those treatments has a different set of standards. In the case of the historic tax incentives, we use the rehabilitation standards. The rehabilitation standards, which are illustrated in this publication, are codified into law for and apply for the historic preservation tax incentives. So the law specifically says that in order for the rehabilitation project to become a certified rehabilitation, it must meet the standards for rehabilitation. And rehabilitation is defined as the act or process of making possible a compatible use for a property through repair, alterations, and additions while preserving those portions or features which convey its historic character. So how does the application process work? The applicant submits an application to the State Historic Preservation Office in their state. The state then reviews the project and works with the applicant to make sure that the application is complete, that all the documentation is submitted along with the application, reviews the proposed work or whatever submittal is presented to them, makes recommendations, and sends it to the National Park Service. The National Park Service then receives the application, makes the final review, and sends the notification to the applicant. The historic certification application process is a three-step process. The part one is mainly used when a building is listed within a district to certify that the building is a contributing resource to that registered district. It can also be to certify that the building is eligible for listing in the National Register, either individually or as part of the district. The part two is a description of the proposed rehabilitation work and includes a written description of the work as well as plans and specification as needed. It also establishes the baseline documentation of the building prior to any work being done. And the last part is the part three, in which documentation that the work has been completed and completed according to the description of rehabilitation in the part two. If that is successful, that part three is the final step in the process. A great number of heritage industrial buildings have been rehabilitated through the tax incentives program, including a large number of textile mills along the east coast of the United States, many of them converted to residential use. Other building types ranging from power plants to aeronautical hangars and Coca-Cola bottling plants have been converted to a variety of new uses as well. Many of these heritage buildings sit vacant for a long time after the original use is no longer needed or the company needs to move to more modern facilities such as this board and ice cream factory in Logan, Utah. So finally, a developer saw the possibility of converting the former ice cream factory into loft apartments and take advantage of the high volume spaces on the inside to create spacious new apartments with lots of natural light. New openings were created along the loading dock on this one-story addition you see on the upper left-hand side, and a canopy was added on the opposite side of the building in order to create some protection from the snow. So, in contrast to that smaller building we saw in Logan, Utah, the Ford Motor Company assembly plant in Richmond, California is quite large. It's over 500,000 square feet, was designed by Albert Kahn in 1930 and incorporates a lot of Kahn's ideas of natural lighting in industrial buildings. The building ceased operation as an assembly plant in 1956, and during the 1989 Loma Prieta earthquake, it suffered extensive damage, so the building was vacant after that. Due to the large scale of the property, there were many failed attempts to come up with a plan to redevelop the building. But finally, in the early 2000s, a local developer came up with a plan to rehabilitate the building for multi-uses that included light industrial, live work spaces, as well as some retail and office space, and then use the main crane building, which you see here closer to the water, as an event space. Some of the design challenges present in the building were maintaining the high volume of the space as well as these large clerestory windows created by the sawtooth roof. To meet the challenges of coming up with a successful rehabilitation plan were the need for to find the right uses for the building and also an architect who understood the character defining features of the building so they would be incorporated in the new design. The partitions that created the executive office in the original Kahn design also show how he used glazing in order to maximize the use of natural light within the space. Obviously, all of these partitions had to be retained. The same concepts were also used in the new design when new partitions needed to be created for privacy or to create different spaces. Large areas of glass were incorporated again to maximize the use of daylighting within the spaces. Again, this view shows how the architect, using uh, Kahn's ideas of natural lighting, maximize the use of natural lighting by keeping the walls away from the window and adding as much glazing to the interior partitions as possible in order to maximize the use of natural lighting. And finally, this is the craneway space, which is that portion of the building closest to the water. This area was left completely open and is used as a multi-function space. It can accommodate concerts and other large gatherings. It can also be subdivided with temporary partitions when the need for smaller spaces is needed. Another feature which was incorporated in the project was the use of solar panels, which, in addition to the use of natural lighting, reduces the overall consumption of energy in the building. And finally, we have the Ottawa Street Power Plant in Lansing, Michigan. At the time of its construction, the building was highly innovative, both from an architectural and from an engineering point of view. The building was decommissioned and later was repurposed for the headquarters of a large insurance company. As this section diagram shows, most of the interior of the building was dedicated to house all kinds of equipment, including these large smokestacks, which were designed to remove as many of the pollutants and heavy metals that were created by the coal combustion, which actually generated the steam for the power plant. So the higher volume within the building actually was in the turbine room, which you can see in this section of the building. In order to retain the sense of the volume, it was decided that even though a mezzanine needed to be added in order to create more square footage inside the building, the mezzanine would be pulled back away from the long elevation, which has these very tall windows. And at the end, there will be two bays left completely open to the full volume of the space. And you can see that on the lower right-hand corner. In the lobby, all extant historic features were retained, including doors and stairs. And finally, in this slide, you see the new addition that was necessary in order to create the square footage necessary to meet the requirements of the new tenant. Without a doubt, many of these projects could not have been successful without the tax incentives, and many of our heritage industrial buildings would have been lost. Thank you for your attention, and thank you for your interest in preserving heritage industrial buildings. For more information, please visit our website, and thanks again.